This is the Minisforum N5 Max. I know. It looks just like the N5 Pro. That's this one. And in that review, I said that this is the most unhinged NAS that I've ever seen. Well, nope. The crown was short-lived. This is even more unhinged. Look, the N5 Pro was already a NAS that had wandered into the server room with a mustache and hoped that nobody asked too many questions. The N5 Pro, on the other hand, apparently found a wizard that was granting wishes. They both have powerful AMD CPUs and a general aura of a product designed by people who looked at a normal NAS and said, yes, but what if the NAS had ambitions? The N5 Max is that same idea, but it made a deal with the devil. It's a 5-bay NAS built around Strix Halo. In this unit, that means it's the AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 class hardware with a Radeon 8060S graphics and an AMD XDNA 2 NPU, 16 cores, 32 threads, 64 gigs of LPDDR5 8533. And this is important because it's the fun part and the catch. On the N5 Pro, the memory was much more normal, DDR5 SODIMMs. You could upgrade it. You could make choices. It has a PCIe slot. You could engage in the ancient home lab tradition of arguing with somebody about RAM compatibility on a forum and eventually trading them some memory, and their name was Storage Goblin 42. With the N5 Max, it's soldered. It's not something you can upgrade later. So this is not a normal NAS in a lot of respects. It is not a file box. It is not merely a place where SMB shares go to have a quiet life. This is an all-in-one home lab building block, I guess is how I would describe it. It's kind of disguised as a NAS, or possibly a workstation disguised as a NAS, or possibly a NAS that got tired of being underestimated and learned that local AI is a thing, just out of spite. I don't know. This is a NAS that I would never recommend unless you already know what you're doing and exactly what you want out of this kind of a home lab appliance. What is the highest and best use case for this? Well, it turns out it's pretty niche. Before we get to the operating system and the unholy things that I've done here, we need to talk about the actual hardware. So we'll just take a little hardware tour and unbox this thing and see what we get. Obviously, if you side by side these two, Minisforum is leaning into modular design, and I hope generational design in the next generation and the next generation we'll see in basically this form factor. 5 mechanical drives and 5 NVMe drives is what this supports. This does not have a PCIe expansion slot or anything like that. If you look at the rear, we have 2 USB 4 V2, that's 80 gigabit, Thunderbolt 5 compatible, basically. You know, can't call it Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt is an Intel technology, but it is Thunderbolt compatible. We also have dual 10 gigabit Ethernet, plus HDMI, plus a Kensington lock port. And notice this one has a built-in power brick, 250 watts, versus our external power brick on the 370-based N5. The N5 Max makes a few upgrades. We also need to take a look at Minis Cloud OS, but first let's take a look at the hardware. Well, that is good news. Our sleds are physically compatible. They are styled a little differently other than just the lock port. A little bit more of a matte finish on these, a little bit less fingerprints. I dig it. To take out your compute drawer, it's only a couple of screws on the bottom. There you go. Easy access to your CR2032 CMOS battery. You got heat sinks on this side for your M.2. It's a really hefty configuration. It's a lot of heat sink here. Now, the power supply is interesting. On the one hand, it's internal. On the other hand, it's modular. You can be of two minds about this. One, if the power brick goes bad, like power supply failure is one of the most common failures. If it's an external power brick, it's typically pretty easy to replace. You can look at the voltage and the wattage, you can get a compatible power brick. Here, it'd be a little trickier. It'd be a little harder to source. If the power supply dies, it's going to hold your information hostage, maybe, depending on your configuration. If you're using ZFS is eminently portable between NASs. You don't get into a situation where you take the drives out and you put it in something else and you have trouble importing. If you're doing a ZFS pool or you're doing a custom operating system, you can do a ZFS pool in Minis OS, but if you do a custom operating system and you still stick with ZFS or another standardized open source technology, you're good to go. The drives and everything, as long as it's available on another machine, it'll work. But it still can be a little bit of a headache for the external power brick. But I know a lot of you in the audience would much rather have an internal power supply than an external power brick. Probably that would be my preference as well. There's also a recessed hidden USB 3 port here. You could use that for storing ISOs. I wouldn't recommend USB for an operating system or anything like that, but you could use this to store reinstallation media or an ISO or something like that you could use in an emergency situation if you just needed some USB storage. This also comes with a 128 gig M.2 for the Minis OS operating system, which we will take a look at in just a minute. But my curiosity was, how do I access our 5 M.2 ports? They're in here somewhere. Well, there's two. Two in the bottom with their own dedicated fan. Kind of, sort of. This feeds the power supply, but we get airflow over the M.2 as well. Oopsie. The other 3 M.2 are in the top, one of which is occupied by the Minis OS M.2. Interestingly, you do need 2 different sizes of Phillips screwdriver. I'm using a single 0 and a number 1. It comes with a little bag of 4 M.2 screws. Pro tip, go ahead and install the screws. That way you won't lose the screws. You just install them. Even if you're not going to use the M.2s, it's worth installing the screws so you don't lose them. I would not say the price out loud near somebody that is financially responsible. Inside and the capabilities, this is where it gets a little interesting. We have the Strix Halo APU. In our tested unit, the CPU identifies as the Ryzen AI Max 395 Plus and the Radeon 8060S, as I mentioned. 16 cores and 33 threads. Single core boost speed here, we were seeing 5.19 gigahertz. And the low clock speed reporting got a little weird, 625 megahertz. Theoretically, it should be a 2 gigahertz CPU frequency floor. I think Minisforum doesn't usually put in that much work into getting the idle power usage as low as possible, but this platform and the pedigree here has apparently done some magical unlocks, because this is the lowest power from a system like this that we've seen from Minisforum. Remember some of the other ones that had the Intel-based SFP Plus ports? I mean, that thing alone was using 30 watts, just the NIC. This thing's running pretty good. Now, the Radeon 8060S is a nice GPU. It's not sitting there with its own separate VRAM island. These things have shared VRAM, that shared LPDDR5. The GPU shows up, it's got 40 compute units. We've got Dev DRI Card 1, Render D128, Dev KFD, and that matters a lot when we talk about containers and the Linux side of this, and the how-to that I wrote for Docker in LXC with VLLM and Lemonade AI server. And that's a little special on this platform. If you haven't heard of Lemonade, you should check that out. Proxmox is making the 8060S do useful work without installing Docker directly on the Proxmox host. This does, of course, bypass the Minisforum software, which I didn't find to be quite ready yet, but you should check out on their website. We'll probably revisit the Minisforum specific software in a month or two when it's a little more ready. The NPU in here is XDNA2, and it shows up at PCI 91:00.1. Now, before we get to the software part of it, I want to show you the BIOS. Let's do a quickie BIOS tour. The BIOS is not just a menu on a machine like this. It smells like a haunted bureaucracy between your operating system and the hardware. It's a pretty typical Minisforum BIOS, so there's not a ton of options, but they also don't lock all the options away. We've got options for network boot, secure boot, and some pretty good control over the platform overall. This is also where we established the theme for the whole review. You've got options. I mean, vibes are the future. This is a small server with a GPU and dreams. The motherboard in Minisforum N5 Max, it's proprietary. It's kind of modular like our N5 Pro. It's a drawer that slides out. The APU and everything else on the motherboard, though, is pretty monolithic. There's not really a ton of upgradability. It was nice to see that out of the box, the full 64 gig is usable and our 40 compute units are accessible and graphics 1151. It's great. For storage, I'm testing 5 C8 Exos 14 terabyte drives. They're SATA 6 gigabit per second, 7200 RPM drives. And then for NVMe, I'm using a Toshiba XG5 2 terabyte for our OS and our Proxmox install. There's also an AirDisk 128 gig. That's what Minisforum ships it with. And I also added a couple of P1600X Optane for our ZFS metadata special devices because I'm a crazy person. So there's roughly 70 terabytes of raw hard drive plus a couple terabytes of NVMe present in a system. That's some pretty good flexibility. The internal arrangement is also pretty good for cooling and performance. The choices that Minisforum made, I don't disagree with. And I want to be careful here. This is not me saying, this is the disk configuration you should use. This is the test configuration. The disk layout is kind of its own religion. And like all religions, you should be suspicious of anyone who says that they can explain it in a sentence or two. The important NAS review point is this. The chassis supports a very dense mix of spinning disk and NVMe, and that opens the door to several useful ZFS designs. And also some designs with Proxmox where you have some operating system drives and then your ZFS pool. So you can do lots of clever things, and you can also do lots of wrong things, but it's a lot of fun. The full PCIe topology is on the forum if you're interested in that for this. And you should look at that if you are serious about using custom software on here, because the topology is where the neat brochure that Minisforum has on their website turns into actual consequences. The thorniest wart here is potentially the J-Micron SATA controller, which users on the forum had trouble with in the past. It has a 64-bit bug in some scenarios, and that is fully explained in the write-up. There's also a GitHub repository, the Minisforum Discord. Those guys figured out what the problem was, but the root problem was silent data corruption. So if you go custom software, make sure that you're not setting up yourself for failure with the custom software. Silent data corruption is the kind of phrase that should make everyone in NAS review stop smiling. A failed disk is annoying. A dead controller is annoying. A pool that says that everything is fine while silently sanding the truth off of your data, that's a different class of goblin. So should be aware of that. Not really a problem here now that it's known. It's not really a hardware problem. It's just, it's a little bit of a hardware bug. And that's why community matters and your feedback matters. Don't install an operating system, see 5 disks, and then declare victory. Custom software is wonderful. Custom software also means that you are the adult in the room. Though I would admit that my inner child is certainly making high-pitched noises when I think about the kinds of problems that buggy hardware will lead to. Now, speaking of high-pitched noises, let's talk about Thunderbolt 5. Intel. It's got an Intel JHL 9580 controller in here. Thunderbolt 5. They added Thunderbolt 5. It's actually Intel's Thunderbolt 5 controller on the AMD platform. Yeah, that means we can call it Thunderbolt 5. Those mad lads. There is no PCIe slot. There's no Oculink. But this really is Thunderbolt 5, 80 gigabit. Although that 80 gigabit is fundamentally limited by the 64 gigabit upstream PCIe connection. So don't look at Thunderbolt 5 and immediately assume that you've discovered a secret wormhole to infinite bandwidth. You have not. And as I often like to remind the viewers of these videos, Thunderbolt 5 is already a situation with terms and conditions. But still, it is extremely interesting that we have a true Thunderbolt 5 controller on this platform. However, I would also point out that in 2026, there's a lot of software development in Linux going on around Thunderbolt 5. And it is leading toward a high-speed, low-latency interface for networking and everything else, for Strix Halo machines. Can you build a cluster out of these? We have in the past, but the software then was half-baked. Now it smells like fresh chocolate chip cookies, which implies that it's fully baked. It's not. You'll ruin it if you take it out of the oven too soon, but it's getting there. And what about a small business cluster use case? Because you can cluster these together. Stop that. Stop. Just, I know you're excited. I'm excited too, as evidenced by the inner child screeching, but because we can do these things does not mean it is viable. And yet I love to see the progress. Years ago, we did Thunderbolt mesh videos, and back then it felt like we were trying to convince a bunch of expensive cables to be a reasonable networking solution, just with sheer force of optimism. And now we're actually looking at Thunderbolt 5 on a Strix Halo NAS as a relatively low latency interface for more, like, could you build a Strix Halo cluster out of these? I am trying. I'm not going to do that in this video. So that's progress. Dangerous progress. Progress I like. But I just wanted to mention it. The real networking and our unit, of course, are our 2 Realtek RTL 8127s. Those are modern 10 gigabit controllers. They're pretty decent. This is a product advertised as dual 10 gigabit Ethernet. And I was also happy to see that all the VLAN stuff was basically working as advertised, which is great. Now, we get to the real question. What is the highest and best use case for this NAS? It's pretty niche. It's pretty narrow. Because if your answer is, I need a place to put some files, then this is absurd. This is beautifully, beautifully absurd. You don't need Strix Halo to store a PDF. You don't even need Strix Halo for an insanely fancy NAS. What are you going to do with a 40 CU Radeon for your family photo archive. You don't need local AI acceleration to serve an SMB share named Tax's old final actual. For an ordinary NAS, this is too much machine. It really is. And in the winter of our discontent with supplies, I don't know. But for an all-in-one home lab with offline AI capabilities, pretty strong offline AI capabilities, then yeah, now maybe we have a conversation. An admittedly very niche conversation, but a conversation nonetheless. So virtualization, AI, media services, home assistant, Frigate in VR, software development and testing and snapshots and containers. And maybe, if you're the kind of person who says temporarily before doing something permanent, a router. Forbidden or otherwise. Yeah, this is a pretty decent platform for all of that. You could build a cluster from these, not necessarily involving even Thunderbolt. 10 gigabits, plenty fast enough. I mean, it's not recommended as the sane or the default choice, but possible in the way that putting a small jet engine on a lawnmower, it is also possible. The point is not that it is wise. The point is that the machine has enough I/O and enough compute that your bad ideas have room to stretch. And certainly this platform does have that. Now, Minisforum, I mentioned, they're leaning into their own software story here. Minis Cloud OS, Minis OpenClaw, and their local AI assistant features semantic search, media hub, snapshots, VM support, permissions controls. They're adding their own ZFS support, which is nice to see. That is an interesting direction, and I'm glad that companies are thinking about those kinds of things and local data. But our guide that we published on the forum does not depend on any of their software. It's Proxmox. Our guide replaces all of that with Proxmox. At the end of the day, remember, this is a PC. It's got HDMI out. You're fine. We are not building on Minisforum software stack. We are not assuming, any responsibilities for Minis Cloud OS. We are not assuming Minis OpenClaw stuff. We're not relying on their permission model. They're like nothing. We literally wipe it or pull the NVMe and install Proxmox and build ZFS. We do the boring, explicit, auditable stuff. And this is important because the value of the guide that I put together is not really copy these commands and receive enlightenment. The value is that you can see the whole shape of what it is that I'm trying to help you accomplish. You can see the firmware and the PCIe topology, the identification stuff, the disk identification stuff, VM layout, the warts with the J-Micron controller network stuff. But you still get local AI and rollback and recovery and all of that on the Proxmox setup that you end up with. One thing that I would like to do, though, is figure out how to make the HDMI, pass through the HDMI somehow to like a Steam Deck living room type experience. And once you're done, the system becomes yours. You understand it. This is where the Proxmox setup starts making sense, I think. It's a server with a mustache, remember? That's what it is. Now, remember my test config with the 5 Exos disks and the ZFS metadata special devices? Oh boy, that was a lot of fun to test and run on this. It was kind of mind-blowing how much horsepower. I mean, this class of hardware is very interesting. The point is not the exact drive brand or the capacity. The point is that ZFS is giving us a foundation for snapshots and datasets and replication and rollback and a deliberate storage layout. And if you're running experiments with local AI and containers and VMs and home automation and maybe agents that can interact with services and documents and the aforementioned old tax returns, well, snapshots are not really an optional decoration. They're like seat belts. The machine is fast enough that you can make mistakes really quickly. ZFS is there so that your mistakes can be educational instead of permanent. In our guide, we have a very particular setup running Docker inside an LXC container. This is deliberate. Running Docker directly on a Proxmox host is not really recommended because Docker makes certain assumptions about how networking works. I mean, it can work directly on the host, but you really, you've taken a hypervisor layer and decorated it with raccoon footprints. So instead, we want to keep the Proxmox host clean and run Docker inside the LXC. There are also community scripts for Proxmox, which Proxmox in a commercial scenario, the community scripts aren't great, but you can use those here and do a lot of really cool stuff. We also have some testing that we did with the encoders and the decoders on our 8060S, and the Docker workloads can actually use them inside the LXC. And that's the interesting bit. It means the containers can see the relevant dev DRI, GPU resources without us turning the host into basically a software junk drawer. And it matters philosophically because the shape of a good home lab is not install everything everywhere and just hope for the best. The shape of a good home lab is boundaries and repeatability and snapshots and rollback and that sort of thing. But one thing I am working on, I would love it if you have gone down this path or you want to show off something you've done, is some sort of HDMI magic trick so you can get an HDMI experience, because this is just HDMI outrunning BTOP here for a Steam Deck-like experience. So you can plug in, the front USB and do that. I mean, this is the best APU in existence. I'd like it not to compete with the AI thing, but very plausibly, this thing is going to be asked to serve media and transcode media and run object detection and generate thumbnails, maybe run Jellyfin or MB or something adjacent to that for feeds from your family photos and videos. Having an offline AI to help organize it really can be a lot of fun. You can dig up old memories and find things, a lot easier and share it with people in your family or your extended family. If the GPU is accessible and the stack cooperates, that's a very different experience from doing everything on the CPU. It's a much better experience. And Frigate NVR, if you haven't heard of that, you definitely should check that out. Frigate NVR is one of the workloads that makes a box like this much more interesting, because it's designed around local object detection. It is commonly used with Home Assistant and IP cameras and, sometimes local inference hardware. If you think scrubbing through a week of footage is a medieval punishment, Frigate tries to identify the interesting parts for you. Person, car, dog, delivery goblin, whatever your cameras and your identification model can detect. That has obvious value, but it also has obvious privacy implications. Running that locally matters. Your cameras aren't just dumping the video to the cloud for folks at Amazon to see. They're information about your home, your habits, your family, your routines, and sending all that to somewhere else and somebody else's cloud. That should give anybody pause. And you can just run it here. It'll just all run on this, and you could just overload it to the nth degree, and it'll be fine because the GPU in here is absurdly powerful for things like that. So run Frigate alongside other services. That's exactly the kind of all-in-one workload where the N5 Max maybe starts making sense. And it is basically a DIY solution. Home Assistant is another natural workload for this system, but let me be very precise. Home Assistant is not AI, and I don't mean to imply that it is. Home Assistant is open source home automation, really just automation in general. It connects devices and automations, and it'll help you build dashboards, and it'll connect sensors and switches and lights and climate controls, presence detection, energy monitoring, and a general collection of small electronic creatures that now live in modern houses can be managed through Home Assistant. And AI can help you with Home Assistant. AI can help write the automations. AI can explain the YAML configuration files. You can just talk to a model running on this and say, hey, we're doing Home Assistant stuff. Here's the Home Assistant documentation. Let's do this. AI can give you a voice interface for what you want to accomplish with home automation. And I look forward to someday having a sentient bathroom light that only obeys commands on Tuesdays, because that's probably where we're headed, right? I mean, doesn't that sound like a lot of fun? Home Assistant itself is just the control plane, and the control plane becomes much more interesting when it lives on infrastructure you control with snapshots and backups. And it's like, oh, they changed something in the update. I don't like it. Click, you've rolled back. Local storage? Yeah, you've got local storage. For the AI side of things, we tested it with both VLLM and Lemonade server, which I think uses llama.cpp. With VLLM, the Hugging Face format models, as a basic smoke test, we tested Llama 3.2 1 billion, and it produced about 15 tokens per second and used less than a gigabyte of VRAM. That's actually not an impressive result. That's actually pretty terrible. But that was, does the plumbing work, not how fast can we make it go? The more interesting result was Lemonade server with llama.cpp and using the GGUF model formats, Qwen 330B, AA3B, and Q8. That was processing around 175 to 208 tokens per second for prompt processing and about 62 tokens per second for token generation, staying under 32 gigs of VRAM. For me, that's the part where the NAS stops looking like a NAS and starts looking like an argument. It's just kind of a lot of fun. If you haven't heard of Lemonade, the Lemonade AI server, you should check it out, because generally it is very well optimized for AMD hardware. AMD is not trying to be the whole like consumer chat universe in and of itself. Think of it more as a local LLM service layer. It can expose OpenAI compatible APIs so that other stuff can sit underneath it and applications can connect to that API and with reasonable performance to give you local models and local workflows that expect sort of a familiar API shape. That matters because in the home lab, it's going to be compatible with stuff that you might not even necessarily be running on this machine. Something else could connect to this and do things. You could automate a mini PC and have the mini PC marionetted from here. We don't really need every AI tool to be a giant monolith with a mascot and a startup pitch deck. By the way, have you seen Turnstone's startup pitch deck? It's pretty nice. Turnstone works great on this thing, by the way, which has a lot of guardrails and a lot of fun stuff. What we need in our home NASs are boring interfaces that can talk to, well, whatever we needed to talk to. An OpenAI compatible endpoint, an OpenAI compatible local endpoint is the right way. Boring is underrated. Boring is how infrastructure survives. And you can use this as a boring building block for something much more interesting. This is also where agentic workflows enter the room. They're wearing a long coat and pretending not to be dangerous, but they are just a little bit. It would be possible to run something like Hermes or OpenClaw inside a VM with access that you control. And that's the key phrase, access that you control. An agent that can answer questions is one thing, but an agent that can take actions is entirely another different thing. That agent can take actions in your home network, against your storage, against your automation system, your media library, your documents, your code, or your other services that you set up. That is not a toy. That is a potential gremlin with root adjacent energy. So if you are experimenting with that, the platform matters a lot, and VM boundaries matter a lot, and permissions matter, and snapshots matter, and ZFS rollback matters. Backups matter, 3-2-1 backup. Auditability matters. That's one of the whole reasons I'm perpetuating Turnstone. I like doing this kind of thing on Proxmox with ZFS because instead of just turning, some random crazy AI agents loose, it's really scary. It's not that Proxmox makes this magically safe. It doesn't, but it does give you better control and containment and rollback and the understanding that, things are happening and you can see what things are happening. Like Turnstone. But that actually could probably be a whole other separate conversation, and it probably should be, because I seem to have strayed somewhat. But the most important thing I want to talk about in this video has very little to do with this specific NAS. All this sounds cool and like a golden ticket, but the golden ticket's kind of pricey. I agree. That's not Minisforum's fault right now, but you already have your golden ticket. You don't need this particular golden ticket. The bigger point is this. Now has never been a better time to get into home networking or self-hosting or building a NAS, and it's not necessarily something expensive. It's not necessarily something new. It's not necessarily something that you have to spend a bunch of money on to actually go do. We've done a lot of content lately around self-hosting and servers and everything else. And with the worsening, economic hardship for everyday people, there's never been a better time. One of the things I keep coming back to is we live in an information economy. So store information, leverage information, meet the oncoming storm head on with information. I mean, that sounds obvious, but empirically, it must not be, because most people rent their digital lives. Think about that. They rent their music, their movies, storage, backups, productivity software. They rent access to files that live on someone else's computer. Companies go out of their way to make it hard to store files on your own local computer and then act surprised when someone else remembers, like, wait a minute, they're a business. They're doing this on purpose. Not every subscription is bad, but some subscriptions are worthless. Most of them are worthless. And by worthless, I mean the subscription has no worth. Services that do this kind of stuff really are just designed to hold you hostage, not actually help you use your technology better. No one is coming to help you use your technology better. Even Apple, maybe at some point they had the philosophy of like, oh, we're going to help you use your technology better. It seems that way only because some of the design philosophy outside of Apple are worse. And it's like, oh, you're being gently punished for not being in the Apple ecosystem. Open source is coming, and the economic crunch is going to lead to a renaissance in open software and open platforms. And Minisforum, for their part, they are leaning a lot on open source and open platforms, and we see that in a lot of products. we see that a lot in the level 1 text community. So that's enough soapboxing. It's been a quick look at the N5 Max, and you know what all I'm about with building around this kind of thing. I love it, but it is so absurdly up and to the left that you have to know exactly what you're going to do with it if you're going to pick one up. But it is pretty badass, if I do say so myself. I'm Littlest Level 1. If you have any questions or I missed anything, you want to hang out in the forum, let's chat and let's build a better future with software. I'm signing out and I'll see you there.